to the Institute for Public Knowledge. Thank you for being here. I'm Eric Klinenberg. I'm the director here, and we're excited about tonight. I'll tell you that this is a topic, the nature of social capital and social connections, that's very dear to me personally. It's something I've worked on a lot in my career, but also a big reason that we're doing this tonight is because Nan Feng, who's been a postdoctoral fellow here at IPK for the last year and a half, is a big part of this book project. And even though the book is not fully out yet, which normally we have a book event, we have books to sell and share, we don't have the books yet. This is a sneak preview of the book that's about to come, but we want it to be first on the agenda so that Nan and one of her co-authors, Ben Cornwell, could present it to us. So I asked what the origin for this project was, and it turns out that there is this group of scholars in sociology who are interested in inequality, who are interested in social connections, and are also interested in social networks properly. And one of the things that happens when you're in an intellectual scene is, you kind of have these connections, and you find students who are pushing you in different areas, and it sounds like Nan at some point recognized that there were lots of data sets out there that could be used to study the nature of social connections and the various ways in which they are shaped by and also shape inequality. Along with Ben and also Christopher Young and a guy who's one of our own here at NYU, Baron Park, who's a PhD student in sociology, they got together and did this really exciting book about, it's called Friends and Fortunes, Social Capital Inequality in America. And as I understand it, there's 25 different data sets that we drew on empirically to understand the nature of inequality around social networks. And amazingly and unusually for sociology, you all put a lot of work into making sure that those data sets are available to readers so that anybody who's interested in trying to see if they can replicate findings has a chance to do that, which is unusual in our part of the social sciences. It takes a lot of work to do that kind of thing. So the nature of the conversation tonight is that Ben, who's the lead author, is going to start us off by framing the book. Theoretically, he's the professor of sociology at Cornell and was the chair of the department until not too long. You do look very fresh.
Yeah, well, they made me chair the year of the pandemic.
Chair during the pandemic. He's published 2 previous books, including Social Sequence Analysis and the Art and Science of Social Research, and over 70 research papers. I just found out he has 3 new books in progress now, so you won't look fresh and energetic for long. So Ben's going to go first, and then Nan, who got her PhD in Cornell in sociology and has been here at NYU for the last couple of years, we'll talk a little bit more about the empirical findings and the data, and then Ben's going to come back up and do some analysis. And then my colleague in NYU Sociology, BK Lee, who works on just about everything related to networks that you can imagine, and is a real source of creativity and innovation in my department. Is going to talk for 10 to 15 minutes. I'll just open it up for conversation, and you can't bring a book home with you tonight, but you all have on your seat a little flyer about how you can order one soon. And so with that,
Thank you, Eric, and thanks to the Institute for inviting me to the city. Always a pleasure to get out a bit for one and I love the city. And it's my great pleasure to speak about our new forthcoming book with Nan Feng. Many of you know her, as Eric said, and who's greatly missed at Cornell. Talk with you about some of the main findings. We don't have a lot of time to go over the whole book, obviously, and there's a lot in the book to unpack. I think Kay will be doing some of that as well, pick up on some of the strands that I miss here. But anyway, the book's being released at the end of the month, next month, and this is an early preview of sorts. So I'm excited for you all to be the first audience. start with some basic theory. Everyone's favorite. Okay, so we orient the book around several interrelated theoretical frameworks. The social network paradigm, social capital research, and also, of course, social stratification. And we adopt mainly a structural perspective on the role that social networks play in shaping people's access to resources. And the way this project began was we really wanted to document inequality with respect to social network ties. So it was first driven by social networks. But then we realized those are forms, and if you're going to talk about inequality, it makes a lot more sense to go one step further and talk about the benefits and potential resources that accrue, especially if you believe the networks are just sort of under neutral architectures for channels and flows of resources. So we added in the social capital part because it's just a necessary and inextricably linked part of our framework. So as I said, it's a structural perspective, though with some allowance here and there for constrained agency, which I can talk about. But in general, we see networks as a sort of architecture that encases and channels the flows of resources that people have come to call forms of social capital. We see this dynamic as something that is not experienced uniformly across the population, obviously, and yet we'll sort of unwind that a little bit through the course of the talk. And it maps onto a variety of important axes of social disadvantage and inequality, whether that's gender, race, ethnicity, age, health, neighborhood, structural, contextual factors, and especially, as we talk about here, material wealth and income. And more on that in a moment. So this just, I'm going to hit you with some references here. Apologize, it's pretty hard here. And there are a variety of forms of social capital or social network ties that are key to the way people have thought about the resources and benefits that accrue to people who have or can accrue to people who have social network connections of various kinds. The most basic form is having access to people having ties to other individuals or groups. It's a very basic way of thinking about social capital. We get into perspectives that focus on closed triads, more internal structural perspectives that are focused more on the capacity for people to coordinate social action, to engage in informal social control, and the generation of trust and echo chambers that allow reputations to form. That's Goodman's perspective, and also Weber's work on social closure comes in here. And I can talk a little bit later about what cover if anyone's interested on why.
Could you just explain what the idea of a closed triad is?
Yeah, sure. So closed triad, smallest social form apart from a dyad, a group of 3 people, okay? An open triad is one in which A is connected to B and B is connected to C, but A and C are not connected. When those 3 are all connected to each other, you get a closed circle or circuit, which allows for people to have indirect and direct access to the third person. It allows for all kinds of new social phenomena to occur, like divide, brokerage potential, gatekeeping, and other things that come into play in theories of triads by people like Georg Simmel and going back through the years.
So, you're in the teaching business. You've got to know what speaking from the diaphragm means. If you could speak up,
Sure.
I wouldn't have to strain.
Sure. The bridging and brokering perspective is closely tied to the issue of closed triads. When we think of social networks, we often think of them in terms of broader structures that have regions, and sometimes smaller groups. Bridging and brokering social capital is the capacity for people to link up different regions of social networks. This comes out most clearly and specifically in the work of Ronald Burt's Structural Holes. Another perspective that's very influential in the social capital literature is Nan Feng's approach, which involves indirect access to resources through ties. So having ties is good in general, sociability, access to support. But if you're connected to people who are disproportionately well-educated, people who have higher prestige, people who can loan you money, those kinds of things, then they're especially valuable in terms of the social capital.
What about a kinship group?
What about a kinship group? Yeah, kinship groups play an important role in other respects of social capital, especially social emotional support and role extension when it comes to social role theory. I'll get to that. Social exchange systems come into play here a little bit. Some social capital theorists focus on social exchange. Social exchange can be both material and non-material. It can take the form of direct reciprocity, as people like Goodman talked about. It can also have to do with more generalized systems that don't keep track of who's reciprocating per se, and they're often trading informal favors and things like that, like neighbors in a community. Can you help me take my trash out or take my dog out when I'm on vacation, or I can't make it home today? Would you make sure the lights are on, or whatever? So those are more generalized systems of exchange that can come in a pooled form or more generalized circular form. Some social capital theorists focus on that. And then more recently, and probably more familiar to people in more political science and government perspective, is the work of people like Bob Putnam, although if you trace it back, this really goes back to the work of a man named Lyda Judson Hannafin in 1916, who talked about the role of meeting ties to groups and organizations as a way of improving the community from the ground up.
What was that name again?
Lyda Judson Hannafin.
His free name?
Yeah, Judson's his middle name. So ties to and between groups and organizations, those in Putnam's theory give rise to generalized trust, which is also a resource that is emphasized in social capital research. So those are the primary theoretical frameworks or orientations that we draw on as we think about different forms of social resources that can flow through networks. Okay. Now, one of the reasons social capital is a favorite concept of sociologists is that it's often seen as sort of a potential savior or counterweight to other forms of capital that people might not have access to, like physical capital, property, wealth. And what people might not have materially, perhaps in theory, they can make up for socially. So maybe they can get it indirectly as opposed to directly. If it's not in their own bank account, at least they can access loans or something through friends. So perhaps they're substitutable forms of capital. That's the basis of the substitutability hypothesis, the notion that social capital can serve as a kind of social leveler. Maybe if somebody's poor in one way, they can achieve some approximation of equal footing with other people who have other forms of capital. It's a little bit more of a pie in the sky way of thinking, the best case scenario for social capital. Okay, an alternative hypothesis hypothesis is that social disadvantage has a kind of cumulative or snowballing character to it, such that people who have access to one type of social capital, one type of capital also have access to other forms of capital as well. So that you'll find that social capital would actually be positively correlated, associated with more material forms of capital. That means the social capital is also going to be unequally distributed through the population, and that it will be disproportionately consolidated within the hands of people who already have other forms of capital, which is the more cynical, worst-case scenario from a social capital perspective. So they're competing hypotheses to some extent, that there's room to think about alternative explanations and interpretations in special cases.
Are you saying that if you have money, you don't need to connect with your neighbors as much?
Not necessarily. I'll get to that. You'll see. It just means that you don't have to in order to get the material resources. But people are still social, and there are other benefits that accrue to people who have social ties. We'll get to those things. And this leads to our key question. Are social network connections so free and widely available that they act as social levelers, can act as social levelers, or as supplements to other kinds of resources, wealth and property? So this is sort of our orienting, motivating question. Is that what we're going to see in the data? And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nan, who will talk a little bit about how we decided to approach this in terms of data, and I'll let you take it over for a second.
Thank you so much, Ben. So I'm going to walk you guys through a little bit about the data sets that we have used. So overall, we used 25 different US survey data sets. We listed some of them here. So you can see that these data sets are actually quite often used in social science research. And then they are mostly population-based or nationally representative. To give some examples, for instance, like we are using survey data sets like American Community Survey, the General Social Survey, Current Population Survey, Time Use Survey, NSHAP, AdHouse, PSID. I actually want to do a quick poll of the audience here. Like, so how many of you guys have used any of the data sets here? Okay, awesome. So, you know, as you can see, this is an evidence that these kind of data sets are actually quite very widely used. So like we're basically walking in as sociologists to say that, okay, so how about social capital in these data sets? There is not yet a way or like a great way for people to think about inequality in social capital. So why don't we just like walk in and then like look at the inequality in social capital in these data sets? Right, so, and then it just comes down to how you measure social capital, right? When we actually walk through all of these data sets one by one, we see that in each of these data sets, there are actually many different measures that previous scholars have suggested that it could be the definition of social capital or like, you know, social networks, right? So how we measure it, it's not like favoring one measure versus the other. We were kind of like doing the way that we wanted to use all these kind of common measures that the previous scholars they have used. To summarize them up, like, you know, we use measures such as personal networks, network resources, group affiliation, social support, social isolation, and so on. To give you a quick example is the core network size. So core network size, it's basically the idea about how many people do you discuss important matters with, right? So like normally in the survey, they capture these kind of data up to 5 people, right? So this gives you a sense about, you know, how large the American core network size is. And then another example could be the group affiliation, like how many groups an average American citizen, you know, is tied to on a daily basis. You know, what kind of groups, clubs, like do you go to? And then we also measure the kind of, you know, like we also ask about like your friends, how many of your friends have a bachelor's degree, how many of your friends have a prestigious occupation, things like that. So this table is in the book, so like this table kind of gives you a quick sense of what kind of measures we drew from what kind of data sets. I apologize that the font here is a little bit small, but like allow me to read it a little bit. For instance, like the first data set like we listed here is American Community Survey, and then we studied it during we studied it like for the period of 1950 to 2019, and then the sample size is about like 60 million overall. And then the variable that we look into is whether this person lives alone, right? Which is a topic that Eric here like is an expert on. Like he has this book, Going Solo. And then we also have other measures, like for instance, like from these data set called app health, like we measure the network closure, and then like whether whether the kids' parents participate in the PTA, things like that. And then here are more of them. So for all these network measures, we basically do two things about them. First, we looked at the inequality level of these network measures. And how do we measure the inequality in social capital? We use Gini coefficient. We all know that scholars use Gini coefficient to measure the income inequality. And we know that the income inequality in the US is pretty stark, right? And then what we find in these data sets is actually lots of measures, they have even bigger inequality than income inequality, which is super interesting. And then the second way that we study the inequality in these measures is to look at how different income groups have different amount of social capital. So we break down the population into 10, generally like 10 income groups, so you have like top 10 income earners and bottom 10 income earners and people in the middle and then that sort of thing. So what we did is like, we looked at how much more or how much less, the top income earners have social capital versus the bottom income earners. And then I'll hand it over back to Ben, and then he can show you guys some pretty graphs that we do for this study.
Thanks, Nan. And I'll just say again that her work was superbly competent on this. It was a Herculean task, obviously, managing all of these data sets and keeping track of everything. And by the way, there is a complete replication package, including your access to Nan's code, right? So everyone can look at it.
Brave scholar.
Everyone's there. So with that, I'll walk through some of the results. No way I can make it through all of them that are in the book, but let me start here. This is one of many examples from the book showing the overall distribution of Americans' core network sizes. You can see it ranges from 2 to 3.5 on the y-axis, but let me start on the left panel. The left panel shows a Lorenz curve, okay, so we can get a sense of the extent to which network size is unequally distributed in the population. This line here is the line of perfect equality. That's what we would see if the population were, everyone had sort of equal access to network size, same network size for everybody. This dotted line, dashed line, is the level of income inequality that we know about. It's around, hovers around Gini index of 0.5 or something in the United States. This line here, so the further away it bends from this line of perfect equality, like this, the more unequal the distribution. This line here is network size. As you can see, it bends away from the line of equality quite a bit and more closely approximates what we're seeing with respect to income inequality. That's an aggregate picture. This is individual level analysis of the relationship between income and number of network members. And you can see this sort of steady climb with confidence intervals going up in a not linear trend, but general upward direction. And a little something about the axis, 2 to 3.5 doesn't sound like a lot, but on average we're finding that people in the top decile have roughly one more core network member than people in lowest. Remember, this is a measure that's capped at 5 in most surveys. So most people say how many people you discuss important matters with, they can name up to 5 people. So a difference of 1 is a pretty big deal. And we do this with a variety of different measures as well. So the distribution of network size, highly unequal and related positively with income. And the book sort of marches through and discusses findings like this with respect to all of those variables that we talked about. They're all laid out in Gini coefficients. We show a number of Lorenz curves. I'll show a few more in a second. And chapter 5 looks at the patterns that you see on the right with respect to the relationship at the individual level between income and forms of social capital. You know, this is looking at levels of inequality with respect to friends' income. I think this comes from AdHealth. So we had actual direct access to information about how much income these students' families had from self-reports of, I think it was their parents who were reporting that. And you can see this line of inequality extends beyond the line of inequality that you see with respect to actual family income. It bends further out. And again, you see this positive relationship here looking at total family income in tens of thousands. So quite a big difference. And with respect to the highest versus the lowest, I think that the top bottom ratio is about 1.9, so 90% greater among the highest decile. Yeah. This is PTA participation. This comes out as an important factor in the work, the foundational work of people like Lyda Hannafan, who is writing about how to improve the school system in West Virginia, for example, by bringing people together into groups, and thereby also expanding their web of connections and getting them to talk about other problems. And he did it through these discussions they were having about the school system. Now, PTA, again, highly unequally distributed by income, and a tighter line and clear relationship with respect to family income and degree of PTA participation. Again, just sort of singling out a measure that is particularly important to some of the foundational scholars of social capital like Jim Coleman and Hannafan and some others who were interested in this type of close involvement between parents and their children's contacts at school, friends, family members of friends, and so on, happen this way. And this is more of the, again, Hannafan and Putnam approach to thinking about social capital in terms of involvement and overall participation in groups and membership in groups. You see these kinds of questions in the GSS. I think this is from the GSS number of groups participated in. Again, sort of bends out further than the Gini for family income, and a tight relationship going upward with between group participation and family income. And this was, as I said, sort of one of the more stark relationships that we see. Yeah, and so we plotted all of the various measures of group participation that we had. Just as an example, we did this with other groupings of social capital measures as well. But cumulative share of social capital, This is the line of equality. This is income, the red line that bends out. This is, I believe, the one we just saw with respect to group participation, and these are other measures of group involvement taken from other data sets. So what I just showed a second ago was one of the more extreme cases, but all of these measures are trending much more close to income inequality than to perfect equality, which we saw as slightly disturbing. So the Gini estimates here, when you boil it down to Gini coefficients, are ranging anywhere between 0.4 and 0.6 compared to the income Gini of 0.5. So they're sort of hovering around the same neighborhood. Okay. Now, don't even bother to try to but what we're showing here are almost all of our measures where we can calculate top-bottom ratios for these measures. And let me just briefly orient you to the way you should be thinking about this. These are all inequality ratios. If you see a dot right here on this line, that means equal distribution for one group over another. The red dots represent the top-bottom ratio with respect to family income. And you can see it's stretching quite far away from the ratio of 1-to-1 for the top decile versus the bottom decile of income earners. Again, income being the red dots. The blue dots are interesting to us because those represent age. Now, what we did with age was we took, this is not thinking about age in terms of direction, older versus younger. This is just which age group has the most of a given form of social capital versus which age group has the least amount of social capital, and how different are they? So, in general, to what extent are we finding social capital concentrated within certain age groups as opposed to others with respect to each of these measures of social capital? Pushing to the right, suggesting high levels of inequality with respect to age across almost all of our measures. It's the measure that gives income the closest run for its money in terms of how much explaining it's doing. And this is, I believe, net of other factors. These are adjusted, yeah. So these are net of each other. Okay, so after we've partitioned out these other. Gender comes in as the green dots. Here you see a little bit more pooling actually on the opposite side, because this is men over women is the way we measure the inequality ratio. And in many cases, we actually find that women have more of certain forms of social capital. We'll get into that. And the orange dots, which are a little more difficult to see, but scattered largely to the right of the equality line, represent the amount of social capital concentrated among non-Hispanic whites over non-Hispanic black respondents. And we can get into specifics of that later if anyone's interested. How are we doing on time?
I think you're okay. Just because we don't know the specifics, one thing I wonder if you could just pause for a minute and tell us if there are any very surprising data points that you'd like us to focus on.
Let me tell you something about age.
The gender one is maybe not a surprise, because we would expect that women would have stronger social ties.
The one that took us by most surprise, I'll get into some of this in a minute, is age. Age is a really interesting relationship with social capital, and I think Nan and I are going to be working on a piece related to this as a follow-up. In many cases, you actually find that the people who have more of a given form of social capital are the older people in the sample. Now, you might think of networking as sort of a young person's game. If you look at it from a Ronald Burt kind of perspective, think about people going out. But a couple interesting things. One, older people tend to be more involved in groups, out in the community more often. They have more network churn because they lose more network members. So they're grappling with things like the emptying of the familial nest and retirement and health problems, the onset of health problems and other things, which actually in some ways draws in more social support. And more interestingly, so you do see this sort of interesting effect of more support for older people, though smaller networks, more kinship-based, role-activated kinds of social capital, role obligations. But they also have more access to people of high prestige. They tend to trust people more, and they tend to accrue social capital in a way that younger people can't. Think about how long it takes to build a reputation. You get it by getting embedded in a network, by interacting with people, and over time, status, reputation, prestige sort of come to you through that. Very difficult to get if you're a sort of young up-and-comer. So in that sense, we actually find that the older people are enjoying a little bit more social capital of that type. And they do go out into the community more, in part because, well, they're making up for lost close network ties, and this is their way of remaining socially connected, and also as a means of tie replacement and homeostasis, which means sort of balancing your networks that looks like it did 10 years ago as much as you possibly can. And it's a greater challenge for them, but they seem to be better at it. Actually, if you look at the data, they're better at dealing with, for example, the loss of a close network member. They tend to rebound more quickly than younger folks do with respect to their access to social capital. So age has, I think, as a general orienting data point, an interesting story behind it. These up here to the right with respect to income, these sort of like off the chart relationships, are things like how much financial assistance can you get from your friends or contacts, socioeconomic composition of your network, access to diverse types of ties, people who are wealthy and people who perhaps are not as wealthy because you're connected to both kin from the old town as well as your new colleagues and your new job and so on. Number of friends with a bachelor's degree, number of friends of high socioeconomic status, greater group involvement, core network size. When you get to about here, you're moving away from access to resources and group involvement, and getting down into things like, are you living with other people and has a way to borrow money if they need it, which is a softer way of probing. Could they possibly do that? You get into things like frequency of contact and trust in local neighbors as well. So those are some interesting findings that you can pull out of this.
Should we have let DK go for a little bit?
Yeah, and I'll just do one more.
Great.
So this is, I think, the most important figure. This is it sort of encapsulates our main findings, and I think it's very interesting. I put it in the concluding chapter as opposed to in the findings. And what this means is the more unequally distributed a given form of social capital is in population, the more it is disproportionately concentrated in the hands of the wealthy in particular. Now the size of these dots corresponds to sample sizes of each of these measures, and the dots are the measures of social capital. But what that basically means is the more a given social resource is up for grabs, the more it tends to be gobbled up by the wealthy, by people who have higher income. So, some takeaways. generalized distribution of social capital is highly unequal, as you can see from the Lorenz curves, the Gini coefficients that we report. Applies to multiple dimensions, holds with respect to multiple individual level attributes, but most specifically and most consistently, and most disturbingly, family income is the most closely associated with the covariates we measured here with respect to social capital. We conclude that it's not a social leveler, that in fact it is hoarded within the hands of wealthier people who make more money, and that social capital has a highly inextricable relationship with other forms of capital, and it's that sort of snowballing, cumulative way that I was talking about. Social capital is not free. Thank you.
Great. I'm B.K. Lee. It's a great honor and pleasure to discuss this book. I want to start with a story about how I met Ben Cornell. When I was a grad student at Columbia about 10 years ago, I invited Ben to a seminar I ran with Peter Bellman. He gave a talk about his first book on sequence analysis. It was a sunny day, and we had lunch and walked outside, had an interesting conversations. Ben remembered this as our first meeting, but this was not the first time that I encountered his work. So before I came to America, I was in South Korea reading his paper, and one was about men's erectile dysfunction, published in the American Journal of Sociology. I was not personally interested in the erectile dysfunction at that time, but his findings were so striking and interesting. So the finding is when a spouse actually dominates a man's relationship to other, which means that spouse becomes a broker of men's relationships, then men are more likely to have develop erectile dysfunction. The paper was empirically rigorous and methodologically creative and theoretically insightful. This combination is rare. The book I'm talking today has the same quality. Friends and Fortunes looks at unequal distribution of individual social network resources. 25 data sets, over 100 measures, more than 60 million people. The scope is huge, and one of those data includes the data I collected for my own dissertation through time-sharing experiments for social sciences. I used it to study how political polarization shapes social networks. Here, the same data answers very different questions about network inequality. I'm excited to discuss this book as someone who studies networks, but from a different angle. Let me start with what makes this book important, then discuss some questions for productive conversations. So what makes this book good? Many scholars have gestured at the idea that social connections are unequally distributed. This book actually demonstrated systematically across dozens of measurement and data sets. Now let me first say what this book is not about. When Roger Chetty published his work on social capital using Facebook data in Nature, many sociologists actually said, we already knew that. What Raji did is impressive. Big data, large scale, variations across neighborhoods, but this book does something different. The authors go back to old familiar data sets, the GSS, ANES, EdHealth, NSHAP, and CPS MIDAS. What is innovative here is that Ben and Nan squeeze new insights from these familiar sources. They ask questions that nobody had thought to ask of these data before. How unequal is the distribution of social network resources? How does it relate to income, age, sex, and race? The answer is sobering, as you just saw. The more than 60% of network measures show Gini coefficients above 0.30, and many of them are even above 0.5. That is roughly on par with income inequality. The rich have more money. They also have more friends, more diverse contexts, more access to high-status network members, more exclusive group memberships, more stable social ties. Income is strongest predictor of social capital access across nearly every measures. This book's contribution is not a single finding. it is the weight of convergent evidence. One data set can be wrong, one measure can be idiosyncratic, but when you see the same pattern across 25 data sets over 100 different measures, this is difficult to dismiss. I want to mention about chapter 2, which is a theory chapter describing the definition of social capital and how people treat this concept. If you have ever used a social capital in a paper, you know the problem. There are too many definitions of social capital, and people use different language to describe the same things or the different things. For Bourdieu, social capital is an individual asset, resources you get through urban networks, convertible into other forms of capital. For Cornwell, it is about the structure of social relationships, closure, trust, and information flow. For Nan Feng, it is about what your contacts have, their prestige, their wealth, and their occupation positions. For Putnam, it is community level things, civic engagement, and generalized trust, and something a neighborhood or nation has more or less of. These are genuinely different ideas, different units of analysis, different mechanisms, different empirical implications. Granoveters, in an interview for this book, calls the concept kind of meaningless, and Richard Sweetberg says it should be killed. Most scholars pick one definition and cite the others and move on. Ben and Nan didn't do that. They didn't build yet another unified theory. They didn't propose a new definitions. Instead, the authors lay out each tradition on its own terms and show where they overlap and where they diverge, and let them coexist. The chapter is a map of the field's disagreement. And if you're a student studying kind of the social capital, this chapter 2 is going to be the thing that you should read. So the book includes interviews with 9 prominent scholars on social capital here and there: Ron Burt, Karen Cook, Mark Granovetter, Seamus Ken, Ed Lauman, Alejandro Portes, Bob Putnam, and Mario Small, and Richard Sweetberg. These interviews are not actually declaration. They show something that journal articles cannot: how the concept of social capital was actually made. And what they show is that social capital theory is itself a product of social capital. So here's a little story behind that. In the 1960s, Becker at UChicago, who invented the term of the human capital, is teaching at human capital Chicago. Cornwell in sociology attends the economic seminars and push back, essentially saying that people's outcomes are not just about their own skills or educations, they are also about the structures around them. Bourdieu, a close friend of Cornwell's, visits Chicago almost every year. So as Ron Burt says, Jim Cornwell studied the conversations, which continued for a good kind of 10 years before he published the term. And Bourdieu was a friend of his and attended his symposia at UChicago almost annually. And the term emerged from those kind of conversations. Meanwhile, Cornwell and Harrison White are fighting like cats and dogs about network positions. And Leo Goodman, on the other hand, tells both of them that they are wrong. And Karen Cook recalls that there were arguments, but everyone actually liked each other. And somebody will start talking, and they usually let them get about kind of 3 words out before they started in on each other. And then Putnam, a political scientist who know nothing about sociology at that time, finds Cornwell's book, Foundations of Social Theory, in a library at the University of Oxford. He reads a chapter on social capital, and that is his eureka moment. From there, he builds a very different version of the concept about civic groups and community. So these scholars were not working alone, and they were in each other's kind of seminar. They were reading each other's books. Bourdieu shaped Cornwell through friendship. Cornwell shaped Putnam through a book on a library table. And Ron Burt watched Cornwell's talk about closure in the 1970s and built structural holes on the other side of the same coin. The concept of social capital was made through the very kind of network process it describes. Ben discovered these connections and laid them out without flattering them into a single narrative, and that is really a hard thing to do. I also want to flag the discussion of Weber in the book. in network research, we lean on Durkheim for social structure and Gerald Zimmel for social form. Weber rarely comes up. The book argues that Weber's 1906 essay on churches and sex is the first real theory of social capital. Here, Weber saw a Baptist baptism in North Carolina, and he understood something Furman would not write down until 80 years later. The value of group membership comes from exclusivity. Sects were picky, and this is what made membership a signal of trust. Open churches gave no such signal. The value came from social closure. So Ben connects this to his analysis of elite networks. Using the River City data, 312 kind of political business leaders in Midwestern city, he shows that the most influential elites are tied to each other through shared clubs and associations. The top 25 elites were 20% more connected than 25 randomly picked members of the same sample. So this is what Weber's exclusivity at work in a kind of modern American city. And this feels relevant today. We watch political leaders make decisions that benefit their in-group. Weber's framework shows that this is not just corruption. It is the logic of closure. And the people inside the network benefit. The people outside don't. One more thing I want to say before moving to the questions. The book is largely and intentionally descriptive. The authors do not force causal claims onto descriptive data. And I'm a believer in the value of causal, helpful descriptive work. When the same pattern appears across dozens of independent data sets with different sampling frames and measurement approach, that is a crucial evidence. The inequality consolidation curve in chapter 6 that you just saw is generally novel findings that could only emerge from this kind of large-scale descriptive work. And let me turn to some questions. And this is moment when the discussion can make a power move, so I'm very excited. So first, one of the key findings is that income is strongest predictor of the social capital across the board, but race and gender show weaker and less consistent patterns. Black Americans have smaller networks and more kin. Women have larger personal networks, but fewer with ties and fewer group connections. But these effects vary by different network measures. I want to push on this. Part of me wonders whether this reflects how the measures are constructed rather than the underlying reality. Many of them capture middle-class, white forms of social life. A measure counting club membership will pick up income gradients almost by design. The race and gender story might look different with measures more sensitive to the kinds of social capital that matter in different communities. Second, related to this, the book describes a lot of different mechanisms that could explain the unequal distributions of network resources and how income shapes such network inequality, including individual agency, Merton's opportunity structure, neighborhood context, structural disadvantage, and health. An elephant in the room is actually racial segregation. Racial segregation at the neighborhood level has decreased over recent decades in the United States, but economic segregation has been increasing through gentrifications, rising housing costs, and school district sorting. I wonder how the authors think about this as a potential mechanism, especially in relation to the income consolidation pattern. Third, the book focuses by design on the positive side of the social capital. The authors acknowledge this in chapter 6, writing that social network ties are neutral channels, but flow through them can be positive or negative. But we know that not all ties are created equal. Some ties constrain, some ties impose obligations that drain resources. My own recent work shows that people who maintain toxic relationships are biologically older and aging faster. I didn't have a measure of income in the data, but I found that people with low SES, like unemployed individuals and racial minorities, are more likely to have hustlers and toxic friends in their networks. This raises interesting questions. If disadvantaged people have fewer ties and more harmful ties, then the inequality picture is even worse than the book suggests. But it also means that having fewer ties is always not bad. I would be curious to hear the author's thoughts on how incorporating negative ties might complicate the existing findings, or any general thoughts on this. First, Weber's discussion of closure and exclusiveness is one of the best parts of the book, but it opens up a question that is not fully pursued: how network externality helps reproduce a linked closure. So Phyllis Garrett and Paul DiMaggio argued in an annual review of sociology piece that network externality can induce social inequality. The basic idea here is that when people decide whether to adopt a beneficial practice, and when networks are homophilous, then the benefits concentrate among similar people, and as a result, widen group-level inequality. If we apply this to the mechanisms of social closure, we can see that the more exclusive the network, the higher the returns to be being inside it. This is a kind of the self-reinforcing dynamic, and I wonder how you think about this kind of network inequality, network externality mechanism as part of explaining these findings. Finally, one interesting finding is that some measures are more unequal than others. The inequality consolidation curve makes this point really well. And community group participations and the ties to high status individuals are both more unequally distributed and more closely linked to income than, say, the number of close friends people have. The book doesn't fully explain why some forms of social capital are more unequal than others. Is it about the cost of maintaining different kinds of ties? Or is it that some forms of social capital actually need other social resources to work? For example, you need money to join a country club, but you don't need money to have a friend. I think there is a good conversation to be had here about what makes some network resources more exclusive than others. Let me close with a personal story again. So I started with how I first met Ben's work in South Korea. In the language of this book, that was a weak time. Through journal articles, not in a handshake. It was one-sided. I know who he was. He didn't know me. And when I invited him to Columbia, I was making this tie stronger. And now, years later, the tie brought me here to discuss this book. My path is a small case study in how network ties form, strengthen, and eventually create opportunities. It is also a case study in privilege. I had access to seminar at a late university at the time. I had the resources to invite him as a speaker. Not everyone had that, and that is what this book is about. So one last thing. So here the preface says people are not usually cognizant of their access to social resources. I think that is right. Reading the book made me kind of more aware of my own networks, who I know, and why I know them, and what I get from them. That was sometimes uncomfortable. And that is the mark of a great book. So a great book doesn't just inform you, it changes how you see your own life. So thanks so much for writing such a book.
Okay, that was a terrific response. Thank you for raising all those questions. Ben and Nan, I don't think you have time to go through answers for all of them, but maybe you want to pick one or two points that you think are important.
One of the issues I did want to talk more about, and thank you for bringing it up, is the findings regarding race, ethnicity, which was, I don't know as much about that literature, but it was very surprising to me that it didn't play a larger role relative to the other factors when we dug in and looked at all these different measures, and how much more income was pushing things away from equality than race, ethnicity was. And the elephant in the room that you're talking about with respect to residential segregation, I think, is important because it helps us to explain to some extent why you can have a case where, friends can be free, and in that sense you do find sort of a lesser effect of race, ethnicity, and you can develop friendships, and you can find friends nearby and trust neighbors. But the view that you get around you of the broader network and the opportunities that are available in sort of a more agentic standpoint, like a bird standpoint, your view is more limited and constrained by that Nortonian opportunity structure that we were talking about. Even if black respondents, for example, wanted more friends and tried to get them, they're often less successful. And there are a variety of reasons, and one of them is residential segregation. It persists, it's still around. They do find themselves more in what Wilson called sort of isolated neighborhoods, especially in sort of hollowed out manufacturing centers like Milwaukee, places like that, Detroit, etc. And they also experience more in terms of unstable social environments, so they're forced to sort of go through this network turnover or churn more rapidly. The higher incarceration rates among their contacts, higher morbidity and mortality rates, especially during the recent pandemic. We see this again and again because of the concentration that exists in disproportionately African American neighborhoods. For example, here in New York, there's some really good maps at the tract level that I could show you if you're interested, that show the relationship between tract level and, for example, how many people in that tract were designated essential employees and had to go out despite the fact that COVID was clearly circulating at higher rates in those areas, and they're disproportionately African American and disproportionately impoverished. So they've got more environmental instability, they're surrounded by more risk, more constraints caused by incarceration, residential turnover, and a variety of other factors that I think come into play that still tie into segregation. Segregation still remains an issue. And that's something that I think deserves to be looked at more closely. So they can get some kinds of contacts, some kinds of ties, but they're not getting those kinds of ties that are stable. Their environments are less stable. They rely more on like what Desmond calls disposable ties. This also comes out in some of the work by Alice Goffman and some of that, and some of the recent work in health on the double jeopardy hypothesis by people like Ken Ferraro. And so they're just like everywhere you look, a number of factors that just seem to compound again and again and again. When you think you found an avenue of escape, there's another barrier. And that comes out too with respect to electronic media, which is something that some people brought up. Well, maybe we need new measures of social connectedness that are more widely available, more freely available. Same again, you get, it sounds like a solution, but then you get the digital divide, and the people who need it most are less likely to have high-speed internet access, are less able to sort of navigate the structure of say Medicare and Medicaid online, and even hospitals, for example, are putting everything in these digital platforms. They just completely lose older people, for example, who just have no familiarity with this stuff, and they have to draw in help from other people. Same story with people who are dealing with sort of entrenched poverty and the institutionalized racism, for example.
Nan, do you want to add anything, or do you want to touch on one of BK's other questions?
I'm actually super interested in the third question.
The negative ties.
Yeah, the negative ties.
Yeah.
So like I read BK's paper, like fascinating paper. You guys are interested. So like one of the major findings in this book is that social disadvantage is associated with more hustlers, and then these hustlers, like they kind of drive you crazy, right? Like if we put it in that way. So that makes me think, you know, like whether it is because people from disadvantaged background, they have less choices to cultivate ties that are good for them, which actually falls back to what one of the major findings where we think, you know, ties is not for free. Like you actually need to start from somewhere in order to gain advantage in there. And then another thought about this is like, you know, you ask like how, you know, including negative ties in our book could have like read the conclusion differently. So I think we need more data. We need more data on networks, and then maybe we will include more of these kind of measures in the coming wave of new data sets so that we can study these kind of questions better.
Just a quick note from the world of the qualitative researchers who are interested in networks. A lot of the debates that you're talking about have real resonance in that world. So for instance, negative social capital, you can think of Mary Patillo's work about black middle class neighborhoods, and one of her core claims is that the black middle class is far more economically insecure than the white middle class, in part because they tend to be much more connected, both physically, in terms of proximity because of segregation, and also within the family, to poor people who are in trouble and experiencing trouble, and their resources are being pulled in that direction, which makes them kind of structurally tied to difficult relationships. And then, of course, like if the way you frame the book in terms of the notion that social capital is the leveler and it's free, versus the social capital is produced by inequality, that's the heart of this kind of, I don't know if there's a debate because they weren't talking to each other, but Carol Stack's All Our Kin book from, I think, 1973 is the case that the social network in black poor neighborhoods is the thing that compensates for incredible poverty, and there's these extraordinarily dense kin networks, and it turns out that kin is fictive kin as well as blood kin, and so she sees these huge networks. But then Orlando Patterson came out with a research that challenged all of those findings, saying that it was kind of romanticized the nature of those networks, and she had overlooked the pressure on black social networks as well. So it's just interesting to note that there is this kind of parallel literature to the debates that you're talking about, but they resonate, and so maybe we'll get those things connected as well. Okay, the floor is open. Let's take some questions if anyone wants to jump in. So 1 and then 2. Yeah. But you're gonna have to speak up because
Yeah, sure.
sound doesn't travel too well in this room. Yeah.
It is a great achievement. I'm really looking forward to reading the whole book. One quick reflection and one quick question. I'm also working on the role of social capital in climate-related disasters, and the main theme and most majority of literature focuses on the positive impacts of social capital in the face of sudden disasters. And it is really eye-opening in terms of that social capital is not as accepted as like social leveler. And my question relates, have you had a chance to look at geographical distribution of social capital and social inequality in your research, or are you planning to incorporate this side?
Yeah, we've done a few things along those lines. So one of the things we talk about in the book is we expand on the urbanicity question, urbanicity versus rural, and in particular we dive into Appalachia, which, as we discussed earlier, through Weber's early work and Hannah Feng's work, social capital is really sort of an Appalachian concept. Partly because they're looking around and trying to fix these broken systems. What resources do we have? But we have these kin-based structures. We have something to start with, and those end up being very important. I think immediately about Kai Erickson's book, Everything in Its Path, which was a book about a disaster in West Virginia, sort of a cold, slurry dam broke up in the hills and ran down a valley and flooded a number of very small towns, just wiped them out. But what was really clever about it, and hundreds of people died, what was really clever about his book is the title, Everything in Its Path. He wasn't just talking about the property damage and the loss of life. He was talking about the social cohesion structures that were undermined by virtue of the way the government responded. Now, they tried to put the people who had lost their homes back together in these shelters. They gave them all the resources they thought they would need, food, some allowance, that kind of thing. But the people ended up being very unhappy. They kept experiencing symptoms of anomie, headaches, fatigue, sleeplessness, depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, those kinds of things. And his argument was it wasn't about reflecting on loss of property, it was about reflecting on social cohesion, because what they did was they put them in these parks that they assigned people into these units that were completely disassociated from what their neighborhoods had looked like before. so they were very dissatisfied with the way that went, and they couldn't sort of knit back together that generalized exchange network that they had come to rely on the best they could. And they had taken great pride in that. So I think there's a lot to be said about the disasters literature as it relates to social capital, and coming back to that as well. Was there another part to that question that I missed?
Let's go to the next.
Okay.
Let's go to the next question.
Do you consider social capital and social cohesion synonymous terms?
No, not necessarily. So for example, if you think about Ron Burt's version of social capital, it's about spanning structural holes and actually living in a space between two groups rather than being deeply embedded within a group. So in some ways he's saying you benefit by people who are not deeply embedded necessarily in a cohesive structure, and that to some extent the ranging out of the network into other regions can be good for example, finding new ideas, new solutions to old problems, and sort of, it was really a comment about creativity. It's like it doesn't come from within, these new ideas don't come from within, they're just importing.
He mentioned people who belong to country clubs and social clubs on an elite level have a higher degree of social capital than poor people. And I can understand, there's a lot of literature that shows that happens. But those connections, when you use the term social capital, those connections are transactional. When you look at a family group, a kinship group, those connections are more emotional. I always puzzled over whether a basketball team has a higher level of social cohesion than, say, a baseball team. Because a basketball team, the people have to work together. You know, I don't know how to describe it, but they work together physically, much more closely. In a baseball team, you each do your job. The pitcher does his job, the outfielder does his job, and that sort of. So I think they would have less social cohesion. I would think that, you know, we always put down on the political machines of the 19th century. We said they were corrupt and all that sort of thing. But they were not. They were very effective. And they were organized down to a block captain. So if you had a problem, you had somebody to go to as an isolated group, you know, whatever. I often wonder if the organization of a political machine creates cohesion, creates social capital, as opposed to the transactional nature of belonging to a, you know, there are some country clubs where you have to be recommended by a member. There are some country clubs where you have to be recommended by 2 members. Now, how well connected do you have to know 2 members in a country club that you want to get into? I mean, you know, that takes some doing. And people on that social stratum are accustomed to that kind of interaction, that kind of hustling, that, you know.
So could I ask, is there something about the nature of the connections that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, so there's, Ed Lauman has a lot to say about this in his interview, and he talks a lot about, you know, he pushes back against Ron Burt, for example, saying that all these people who are sort of benefiting from an agentic view of the world around them and sort of see this opportunity and they go after it. And he said, sometimes those things are an obligation. Like if you're in a government and you're in charge of distributing resources, you know, this is something you do not for personal benefit or gain, but rather out of a sense of your position in a larger structure. You know, Ed, of course, being a student of Parsons, believed in systems, and I see what you're saying very much as aligning with that perspective. That is the idea that a lot of social capital comes from positionality within structure, within hierarchy. To some extent, you have to have functionally people who can see the whole view landscape and who have control of the buttons over where this is going to go, where that's going to go in distributional sense. One of the things that the work they did at Chicago brought out a little bit more, and the stories around the Chicago Symposia are fascinating, and said you should have been there. But one thing that you find is that people who are more positionally connected tend to have an easier time. The connections come to them more often than them having to go out and create them themselves, so they're self-generative, largely from a positional perspective. So you have to overlay that alongside what some sociologists now focus on with respect to informal social connections among elites. Their involvement in clubs, hobby groups, and things like that, these sort of informal dinners and things that they have. Those do overlap. I don't remember who it was who did an early study of the degree of overlap between elites' informal personal connections and the more formal transactional connections, but they do overlap. And you find them converge over time. Who knows which way it's going? It's probably going both ways. You know, they overlap because they get to know each other. You get to know each other's hobbies and interests, and then they go hiking with each other on Appalachian Trail or something. And at the same time, the fact that they get to know each other through informal connections, maybe the same educational institution, ties in common, something like that, through these kinds of connections, they can form business relations in a more relaxed way through trust and reputation.
There's nothing in American, I often wondered if there was higher level of social cohesion in socialist cultures than in capitalist cultures. Some of the colleges, at Hunter, you could take classes for, if you're an old person, you could take classes in the class. And so I was in an undergraduate class for the first time in 1,000 years, and I noticed that the kids at Hunter did not form study circles. I was shocked, absolutely shocked. When I was an undergraduate, 1,000 years ago, albeit, but nonetheless, I had a study circle in every class that I took.
So I've been loving all your comments, so I just want to get some other voices involved. So thank you, that's great. They're great things to think about. They're great things to think about.
Our society doesn't encourage that kind of connection among people.
Super interesting idea. Yeah, Mike.
It's why we hate Zoom. Because there's no flesh in the game. But I actually raised my hand.
No time after class.
Yeah.
So all this stuff that's important.
I've got one factoid to just tack on to the Appalachian theory of social capital. Jim Coleman is Appalachian adjacent. He grew up on the Ohio side of the Ohio River, but across the river from where Kentucky bumps into West Virginia.
Tri-state area, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm from Cincinnati, so I was born in West Virginia.
Okay.
When I went to Chicago, I learned that Ed was also from Ohio. From Youngstown.
So southeast of Steubenville.
Yeah. So and
southwest of Steubenville.
I spent summers down in West Virginia. More so than J.D. Vance.
Yeah. I actually raised my hand not for that, but to talk about reciprocated ties are actually sort of the reverse of the way we usually ask about them. I know in Ad Health, because they did whole schools, you can see not only how many friends people pick, but how often they were picked. And there's this old adolescent society finding that the rich kids get picked way more often. Is that one of your outcome variables on the list we could not read? And if it isn't, it's probably too late to add it. But
yes, we do. Yeah, we analyze the ad house as well. It might not be in some of the graphs just because ad house is restricted data.
Right.
We were not allowed to link it with CPS or like other kinds of like.
But we get the
But
same
yes,
thing
that
with
was
But
the
if you
one
can
of the
amplify that, because I think that's another angle on the hyper impact of income that would be a circle on your chapter 6 bubble graph that would stand out there. And the other one would be, there's the Verba-Nye political engagement have you signed a petition, have you called your congressman, et cetera. Would your congressman return your phone call? You can't ask that in a survey because the people who answer yes to that don't answer the survey. But if, as a thought experiment, I think it would also be an anchoring point way the heck up in the upper right quadrant of your chart. And if you can invite people to think in those terms, I think it can add, you've already got a strong empirical base, but I think imagining all these abstract things as behavioral and tangible activities that break the agency, the bird, everybody is rational and separated, and adds a little more of that two-way element to it.
What's ironic about that too, to think about dualistically, is that the more somebody gets to that point where people look to them and they're like, I want to be connected. This goes back to the old prestige hypothesis versus the like me hypothesis. Which one do you want to be connected to? Somebody who's like you or somebody who has that prestige? So for Lauman was a key sort of tension in how people form their relationships. And for the wealthy people, it's the same thing. They don't have to make that decision really. So, but the irony is that the people that you want to be connected to most because of that, sort of the Matthew effect that physicists, network researchers like to talk about. Preferential attachment, I think, is the term they use. When a new person enters a network, they go for the most connected, try to get connected to the most connected person. It's the one they hear about most because of algorithms, etc., the way those are set up. They're set up to make them, but they're also the most impenetrable.
Right.
They form, they have that closure around them. I mean, you think about these dinners that people like Trump have, and they're literally armed guards encircling these dinners, for security reasons. But at the same time, that means the people who want access to this thing are not going to get it, So the people you want to be connected to most are the least accessible.
Last thing, one more suggestion. Since the book is written, and I guess we're not going to get any more late changes, it's coming out in a few weeks. Because of what BK said, that you have this amazing descriptive data with 25 different data sets, and you see trends there, and they're hard to dismiss. There are a bunch of popular opinions framed as facts that shape our conversation about whether America, the state of our social life, like we have no friends anymore, or we've never been so lonely. All the things that we know that are the staples of the public conversation about the state of our social union. I can't think of a group of authors who are better positioned to weigh in on which of those things are real and which of those things are artifacts or cudgels used by people who have an axe to grind and want to make a particular point. Because I will say, scholars have been maybe the most guilty practitioners of cherry-picking a finding from a particular study that suits their theoretical interest or political position to make a case on these matters. And because they're so central to the debate about why are teenagers feeling stressed and anxious, and why do people vote against their own material interests, and all those kinds of things, you really are uniquely positioned to publish an op-ed in some high-profile place that's like the 10 most important, the 10 myths about American social life and things that we've discovered. I don't know what the big idea is, but already you have a finding there that would give anyone pause if they wanted to say that people don't have friends anymore.
Yeah.
And I think there's probably a bunch of other stuff like that too. So I'd encourage you, since the book is already written, and since you're writing about something that's not just for other social scientists, but matters of public knowledge to be taken up in institutes like this one, that you should really take the moment to do that. So please join me in thanking the authors.